For more than 12 centuries, one name has echoed through the mountains of Tibet. Some remember him as a wandering master, others as the lotus-born. To millions of Buddhists, he is Guru Rinpoche. Yet behind centuries of devotion, a question still remains. Who was Padmasambhava? Tonight, we are traveling back to the 8th century, not to witness the rise of an empire, nor the story of a conqueror, but to follow the journey of one human life, a life that would forever change the spiritual history of Tibet. This is a world without modern borders, without cameras, without complete historical records, a world where history survives only in fragments, and where tradition preserves what history cannot always explain. Some parts of this journey are supported by historical sources. Others have been preserved for generations in Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Throughout this documentary, we will explore both, not to prove one right or the other wrong, but to understand how an unknown wandering teacher became one of the most influential figures in the history of Tibetan Buddhism. Because perhaps the greatest mystery was never how Padmasambhava was remembered. It was how one human life could leave a legacy that has endured for more than 1,200 years. To search for that answer, we must return to the 8th century.
Every extraordinary journey begins somewhere. For this one, it begins with a place, a kingdom that has challenged historians for centuries. Ancient texts call it Oddiyana. But where was Oddiyana? Even today, no single answer exists. Most historians believe it was located in the fertile Swat Valley of present-day northern Pakistan. Others point toward different regions across the greater Himalayan world. Its exact location may never be known. Yet remarkably, its influence has never been forgotten. Because in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Oddiyana was remembered as far more than a kingdom. It was a land associated with meditation, wisdom, and extraordinary spiritual masters. And according to that tradition, it was here that something happened which defies ordinary explanation. A beginning that is not described like history, but like a vision. Not with the birth of a prince, not inside a royal palace, not beneath a crown, but beside the still waters of a sacred lake. Tradition remembers the lake as Danakosha. One quiet morning, its surface lay perfectly calm. The wind disappeared. The mountains stood silent. Even time itself seems to pause in the telling. Then, from the center of the lake, a single lotus flower slowly emerged. Not rushed, not broken, but unfolding, as if the water itself was revealing a secret. Petal by petal, it opened, and within it, a child appeared, 8 years old, completely still, as if he had not arrived, but had always been there. No fear, no confusion, only a presence that felt strangely aware, as though the world around him was already familiar. Tibetan Buddhist tradition remembers this child as Padmasambhava, the lotus-born. History cannot confirm this moment, but the tradition does not present it as ordinary history. It presents it as meaning, as symbol, as revelation. And for more than 12 centuries, this image has remained one of the most powerful foundations of Tibetan Buddhism. Because in that single moment, a lake became a threshold, a lotus became a doorway, and a child became the beginning of a story that would reshape an entire spiritual world. And according to that tradition, this child would soon be taken from the silence of the lake into the heart of a royal court in Oddiyana, where his life would begin as a prince. Suddenly, The silence of the lake was replaced by the sound of a palace. Royal ceremonies, music, fine robes, teachers, servants. And around him, every privilege a future ruler could possibly inherit. For most people, this would have been the destination. For Padmasambhava, it became the beginning of another question. Because behind the beauty of palace life, he began to recognize something that no palace could hide. Everything around him was temporary. Youth became old age. Health could become illness. People who were present one day could be gone the next. Even kings could not command time to stop. And slowly, the very things that were supposed to satisfy him began to lose their power over him. Think about that. He wasn't trying to escape poverty. He wasn't searching for status. According to tradition, he already had what countless people spend their entire lives trying to obtain: comfort, wealth, respect, and eventually a throne. Yet the more the world offered him, the deeper his questions became. If everything we possess can eventually disappear, what are we really holding on to? If power cannot protect us from suffering, how powerful is it?
And if even a king must eventually face death, what is actually worth searching for? These were no longer the questions of a future ruler. They were the questions of a seeker. And eventually, Padmasambhava faced a choice: remain inside the world that had given him everything, or walk away from it for something he could not yet see. No guaranteed destination, no kingdom waiting beyond the gates, no certainty that the answers he wanted even existed. Only the unknown. And according to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, he chose it. One morning, the prince who could have inherited a kingdom turned away from the palace, away from comfort, away from power, away from the life already chosen for him, and stepped into a world where his title meant nothing. He left as a prince, but what he would become on the road would eventually carry his name across the Himalayas. The palace disappeared behind him. The title of prince meant nothing now. And from this moment, Padmasambhava enters the most mysterious period of his life. Because we know where his journey would eventually lead. We know the name by which millions would remember him. But what happened in between? How did a prince who walked away from everything become the master later generations would call Guru Rinpoche? Here, the historical trail becomes faint. The surviving records do not give us a complete map of these years. Much of the journey comes to us through later Tibetan Buddhist biographies and tradition. And those traditions describe years of wandering across the Indian subcontinent, from teachers to isolated places of practice. Padmasambhava is remembered as searching for something no palace had been able to give him: understanding. He studied Buddhist philosophy, meditation, Tantric practice, and increasingly, the workings of the human mind itself. But some of his most important classrooms, according to tradition, had no walls. Remote caves, wild landscapes, and places most people deliberately avoided. Cremation grounds. Imagine entering one after sunset. Funeral fires burning in the darkness, smoke rising into the night, human bodies returning to ash. For most people, it was a place to leave as quickly as possible. For Tantric practitioners, it could become a place to confront the one reality human beings spend their lives trying to escape: death. There, titles meant nothing, wealth meant nothing, power meant nothing. A king and a beggar eventually faced the same truth, and perhaps this is where the prince's decision to abandon the palace begins to make sense. He had walked away from comfort only to place himself directly in front of everything human beings fear losing: life, identity,
attachment, the illusion of permanence. The purpose was not to worship death, it was to stop running from it, to look directly at fear and understand what remained when fear no longer controlled the mind. According to later traditions, Padmasambhava continued moving, learning, practicing, teaching. His journey also brought him into contact with figures who would become inseparable from his later story. Among the most important was the Indian princess Mandarava. Tradition remembers her not simply as a royal woman who encountered Padmasambhava, but as an accomplished practitioner who followed the Vajrayana path alongside him. Their story would later become surrounded by extraordinary religious accounts. But for our journey, something more important was happening. The man who had once been surrounded by palace walls was building a reputation far beyond them. Students began seeking him, stories traveled. His name moved along the same routes used by pilgrims, merchants, scholars, and monks. And somewhere during those years, the identity of the prince began to disappear. In its place, a master emerged. People would come to know him by another name, Guru Rinpoche, the precious master. But his greatest journey had not even begun. Because beyond the highest mountains on earth, word of this wandering Tantric master was about to reach a powerful kingdom undergoing a transformation of its own. And soon, Padmasambhava would receive an invitation that would carry him across the Himalayas and into the history of Tibet. By now, Padmasambhava had walked away from a palace, crossed lands far beyond the kingdom of his youth, studied with masters, meditated in places others feared to enter, and become known as Guru Rinpoche. But then, something else happened that would change the scale of his story completely. Far beyond the Himalayas, one of Asia's most powerful kingdoms was searching for someone like him, Tibet. This was not yet the Tibet the world would later recognize. Buddhist monasteries did not dominate its valleys. The Dalai Lama institution did not yet exist, and the great Buddhist civilization that would later become inseparable from Tibetan identity was still being formed. This was the 8th century. Tibet was an empire. Its Burmese had crossed mountains. Its influence stretched across enormous territories. Its rulers dealt with some of the greatest powers in Asia. And yet, a different kind of transformation was beginning within the empire itself. Buddhism was taking root. King Trisong Detsen wanted to establish the Buddhist teachings more firmly in Tibet, but changing the spiritual landscape of an ancient civilization would prove far more difficult than an issue of a royal command. There was resistance, political resistance, cultural resistance, and according to later Tibetan Buddhist tradition, something else. The stories remember unexplained obstacles, disrupted construction, and powerful forces believed to oppose the establishment of Buddhism. To people living in that world, mountains were not simply mountains, lakes were not simply water. The landscape itself was understood as alive, filled with guardians, local deities, and unseen forces connected to the land. So Tibet faced an unusual problem. A king could command soldiers, a scholar could explain philosophy, but neither alone could transform a world people had believed in for generations. Tibet needed someone who understood transformation itself. And across the Himalayas, there was already a master whose entire life had been shaped by exactly that idea. A prince who had transformed privilege into renunciation. A wanderer who had confronted fear in cremation grounds. A practitioner who taught that the darkest parts of the human mind did not always need to be destroyed. They could be transformed. His name had reached Tibet, Guru Rinpoche. An invitation crossed the Himalayas, and Padmasambhava accepted. Imagine that journey. Ahead of him stood some of the highest mountains on Earth, thin air, frozen passes, remote valleys, and somewhere beyond them, a civilization he had never known, waiting. When Padmasambhava finally entered Tibet, Tibetan Buddhist tradition says his first great confrontation was not with an army. It was with the powers believed to inhabit the land itself. Stories tell of mountain deities, spirits, and fierce local guardians who challenged him. But here is what makes these stories remarkable. Padmasambhava does not simply destroy them, he transforms them. The beings once described as obstacles are made to swear oaths, and those who opposed the Dharma become its protectors. Whether we understand these accounts as sacred events, as religious symbolism, or as later memories of Buddhism encountering Tibet's older traditions, the underlying idea is striking. Padmasambhava's victory was not about replacing one world with another. It was about transformation, fear into wisdom, resistance into protection, conflict into a new spiritual order. And perhaps that explains something important about why his influence became so powerful. He did not arrive in Tibet carrying an army. He did not take a throne. He did not build an empire in his own name. Yet the wandering prince who had once abandoned everything was now standing at the center of a transformation that would outlive kings, dynasties, and eventually the Tibetan Empire itself. But Padmasambhava's greatest legacy in Tibet would not be a story about spirits. It would be something real, something physical, something whose influence can still be traced more than 12 centuries later. A monastery, a generation of translators, and the beginning of a Buddhist intellectual tradition that would help reshape Tibet forever. Its name was Samye. The stories of spirits, mountain gods, and supernatural encounters would eventually make Padmasambhava a legend. But they were not his greatest achievement. Because defeating an enemy can change a moment. Building something that survives you can change a civilization. And in Tibet, that work now began. At Samye, together with King Trisong Detsen, the Indian scholar Shantarakshita, and a growing community of monks, scholars, and translators, Padmasambhava became part of an extraordinary experiment. For the first time, Buddhism would not simply visit Tibet, it would begin putting down roots. Samye became what is widely regarded as Tibet's first fully established Buddhist monastery. But calling it a monastery almost understates what was happening there. Imagine entering its halls in the 8th century, monks learning unfamiliar teachings, Indian scholars explaining ideas developed over centuries, Tibetan translators listening carefully, searching their own language for words capable of carrying concepts that had never been expressed in Tibetan before. Sometimes the right word did not even exist yet, so they had to create one. Think about what that means. They weren't simply translating books, they were helping build an intellectual language. Philosophy, meditation, ethics, logic, psychology, entire systems of Buddhist thought were being carried across languages, one sentence at a time. And something remarkable happened. Ideas that traveled north from India began taking on a Tibetan life of their own. Texts were translated, students were trained, monastic communities developed. Knowledge that once depended upon a teacher physically crossing the Himalayas could now survive on a page. And centuries later, when many Buddhist Sanskrit works disappeared from the Indian subcontinent, important parts of that intellectual world remained preserved in Tibetan translation. That may be one of the least dramatic parts of Padmasambhava's story, but historically, it may also be one of the most important. Because miracles depend on belief, knowledge can travel through time. But Padmasambhava's influence reached beyond manuscripts and monastery walls. The same principle that defined the stories of his journey appeared again in his teachings: transformation. Fear did not always need to be escaped, it could be understood. Attachment did not simply need to be hated, its energy could be transformed. Even obstacles could become part of the path. And this helps explain something unusual about the Buddhism that developed in Tibet. The older world did not simply disappear. Sacred landscapes remained sacred. Local protectors remained present. Ancient cultural memories survived, but many of these elements were gradually reinterpreted inside a Buddhist universe. Padmasambhava's lasting power, then, was not that he erased the Tibet that existed before him. It was that tradition remembered him as helping transform what was already there. The prince, who had once walked away from a kingdom, had helped build something far more difficult to inherit: a tradition, a language of learning, a spiritual system capable of passing from teacher to student, from one generation to another, and eventually far beyond Tibet itself. But Padmasambhava appears to have understood something every civilization eventually discovers. Buildings can fall. Books can disappear, kingdoms can collapse, even teachings can be forgotten. So according to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, before his story in Tibet came to an end, he prepared for a future he would never live to see. He began leaving teachings behind for people who had not even been born yet. Padmasambhava had helped plant something in Tibet. But according to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, he was already thinking about a problem far beyond his own lifetime, because he understood what history does to everything human beings build. Kings die, empires collapse, monasteries burn, books disappear, and knowledge can be forgotten. So, tradition says Padmasambhava prepared for people who had not even been born. Among those closest to this work was Yeshe Tsogyal. Remembered as one of Tibet's greatest female practitioners, she became far more than a disciple. Tradition remembers her as a master in her own right and as one of the great preservers of Padmasambhava's teachings. Together, they are associated with one of the most extraordinary ideas in Tibetan Buddhism: Terma, hidden treasures. Tradition says teachings were concealed across the Himalayan world, inside caves, within mountains, near sacred lakes, and sometimes not in the landscape at all, but within the minds of future practitioners. Why hide a teaching instead of simply giving it to the world? Because according to the Terma tradition, some teachings were not meant for the present. They were meant for the moment they would be needed. Years could pass, centuries could pass. Then, a future master known as a terton, a treasure revealer, would discover them. For believers, it meant something extraordinary. Padmasambhava's teaching did not belong only to the 8th century. It could speak to the future. But eventually, Padmasambhava himself had to leave Tibet. And here, history becomes quiet again. We do not possess a contemporary historical account that tells us with certainty where his final journey ended. Tibetan Buddhist tradition remembers something very different from an ordinary death. It says Padmasambhava departed for Zongdok Palri, the copper-colored mountain, a pure realm where, according to tradition, Guru Rinpoche continues to benefit sentient beings. History cannot take us there. It can only bring us to the edge of the evidence. And perhaps that is where we should stop. Because 15 minutes ago, we began with a question: who was Padmasambhava? We followed the memory of a child appearing on a lotus. A prince who walked away from privilege, a wanderer who entered places others feared, a practitioner who became a master who crossed the Himalayas, and a teacher whose name became inseparable from the spiritual history of Tibet. But after more than 1,200 years, history and tradition still do not give us exactly the same Padmasambhava. History leaves us fragments. Tradition gives us something much larger, and between them stands a man whose influence survived the world it produced. The Tibetan Empire eventually disappeared. Kings became names in history. Generations came and went, but the name Guru Rinpoche did not disappear with them. It crossed centuries, mountains, languages, and eventually continents. His image remains inside monasteries. His teachings remain within living traditions. His name is still recited, and his story is still being told. Perhaps that is where the mystery of the lotus finally becomes meaningful. A lotus rises from dark water, yet opens above it. Maybe that ancient image was never preserved simply to tell us how Padmasambhava entered the world. Maybe it survived because generations of people believed it told them what he represented within it. Transformation. From prince to wanderer, from wanderer to master, from one human lifetime to a legacy spanning more than 1,200 years. So perhaps the greatest mystery was never whether a child really appeared upon a lotus. It is this: how did one life become a story powerful enough to outlive an empire? More than 1,200 years later, we are still telling it.